All right, guys, my special guest tonight is award-winning journalist Max Blumenthal from the Gray Zone. Max, welcome back.
Good to be here. I got to let a cat out of the room, so give me 10 seconds.
All righty. It's been a busy day today, you guys. Busy day. Oh, Pat.
All right, cat
Welcome
cat
back.
ejected. Yeah, good to be back. Caught you on Jimmy. Very high energy performance. I was like, it was a hard act to follow.
Oh, man. I'm so frustrated, Max. Like, that's one of the things I want to talk to you about. I know recently you spoke to Rokana,
Yeah.
and I just have to ask, like, where do you see this going in reference to progressives going into the Democratic Party? What's some of the sentiment that you've been hearing on the ground in DC? Because I'm in Massachusetts. Massachusetts is a little bit more progressive depending on which area of the state that you're in. But in DC, what are you hearing from people in reference to voting for progressives and putting them through the Democratic Party, especially for people like Rokana?
Well, I mean, I saw you talking about Nina Turner, and I just had this feeling when she declared her run for Congress. I was just like, no, this is like so yesterday. It just felt so played out. And her ad where she talks about how angry she is and everything, it didn't really feel sincere to me. And now, I mean, I just can't believe it's still happening. And I don't think anyone is really excited about it that I'm in touch with, but there are still so many people who still believe that the Democratic Party can be an avenue for progressive change, that it can even be a vehicle for socialism in America. And that's not limited to Washington, D.C., but, you know, in Washington, when you come here and you want to do any of that, you immediately are changed, because you're incentivized to change. You're incentivized to become a Ro Khanna, especially on foreign policy. And there's really very little room for challenging the imperatives of the national security state in Washington. And that's because you will have your character assassinated instantly if you touch the third rail. That's what happened to Tulsi Gabbard. I mean, Tulsi Gabbard was someone who was not a very controversial figure several years ago, but she had a lot of vulnerabilities that could be played on to assassinate her character, specifically within the left. And as soon as she touched the issue of Syria, the dirty war in Syria, the US actually arming al-Qaeda affiliates inside Syria, introducing a resolution to cut off the arms, which no one in Congress supported because for some reason it's controversial to oppose arming the organization that was responsible for the 9/11 attacks. That's when she was just destroyed. And now you see her kind of aligning herself with the political right because there's nowhere else for her to go. The left just completely rejected her. The Bernie campaign rejected her endorsement. So I caught Ro Khanna. I knew exactly what Ro Khanna was going to say and do, just because I know how the city works and I knew what kind of character he was and I'd seen him around. And I always considered him to be a gigantic phony when he pretended that he was some kind of peace candidate. So I saw him go into a cafe on Capitol Hill, and I was like stalking Capitol Hill, looking for members of Congress to politely interview about Ukraine and the massive arms shipment that the U.S. was about to deliver, which was going to transform this conflict into the most dangerous proxy war of our time.
Yep.
And I waited outside the cafe for him, and he came out. I questioned him. You know, to his credit, he answered my questions and didn't just walk away. But his answers made him sound like a Reagan-era neoconservative fighting the Soviet Union. And it was pathetic, predictable, and sort of infuriating, and really shows. I mean, if AOC had been walking down the street and she and I had caught up with her, you would have gotten a much more contorted response. She wouldn't have known what to say because she thinks that she has to cater to a lot of like anti-war and anti-imperialist people who are still duped by her whole image. But she also has ambitions in Washington. Ro Khanna, he doesn't care about the grassroots anymore. He's going full Washington. He may have national ambitions. He may see himself as the next Bernie Sanders on the national stage. But that really shows you where things are at. And none of them, whether it's AOC or Ro Khanna, can really articulate why we need to send weapons to Ukraine, except in neoconservative moralistic terms, that they're standing up for freedom and democracy, which we know is not the case at all. So that's where we're at. It should be like a brick wall for anyone who's actually anti-war and who wants to get into the Democratic Party. They should just see this and be like, no, I'm not even going to play that game. But I still see it happening. I mean, I was just out in LA and I saw, there's some progressives running for Congress there who are trying to change the Democratic Party from within, running against some truly awful Democratic candidates. And, TYT's hosting them, and, the wheels of the squad they just keep trundling ahead.
Yeah, I think it's ridiculous. I thought it was interesting that you were asking him about his stance on war, because I remember he at one point he said he was anti-war. And in your conversation, he said, well, yeah, I'm anti-war except for this situation and that
Yeah.
situation. I'm like, no, you're not anti-war.
Yeah, he's like, I was against the Iraq war, basically because it was an unpopular Republican war and Americans were coming back in body bags or with their legs and arms blown off. So it was politically expedient. But this war, the American public is propagandized into a state of mass formation psychosis. So I'm for it. It's a just war. It is a great war. He's calling it a just war. Where's the justice in arming the Azov battalion? Where's the justice in supporting Ukraine, which is assassinating, kidnapping, and torturing dissidents, when Zelensky has arrested his second most popular politician in the country, his top political rival, banned all opposition media, and formed all other media into a united news network that broadcasts 24-hour war propaganda? Where's the justice in that? What is the point of any of this? Where is the justice in destroying the American economy, depriving farmers of fertilizer, raising gas prices for working class Americans, and raising food prices in order to show resolve in the face of Putin? What is the point of that? And, despite the blitzkrieg of Clockwork Orange style propaganda attacking the cognitive abilities of Americans, more and more people are starting to ask those questions. And I think by the time Ro Khanna if he does throw his, hat into the national ring, no one on the, the critical part of the left will have any patience for him. I think they pretty much lost it already.
Why do you think people aren't asking Ro Khanna about his donations that he receives from Silicon Valley? Because I see, like, if someone like Ro Khanna became president, I am very worried about that, because I did see an interview that he had where he said, well, in reference to tech, I'm pro free speech, but at the same time, we need to limit what people say. And I was like, what? That doesn't make any sense. So for people who don't know, Ro Khanna gets a lot of money from Silicon Valley. His wife, if I'm not mistaken, also receives money from the military industrial complex. So
Yeah.
I'm kind of curious as to why Ro Khanna is still able to say that he's progressive, and why more people are not calling out where he's getting his funding from.
Yeah, Ro Khanna's wife has continued to make investment trades in General Dynamics, which is a supplier of 500-pound bombs to the Saudi military, responsible for one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world in Yemen. They're also making a literal killing in Ukraine now. So why haven't they made anything of that? They are. I mean, it's out there. Realsludge.com, which is sort of a progressive publication that kind of supports the like the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, went after Ro Khanna on that. So it's out there. The thinking of people like Ro Khanna is that those of us who come from kind of a progressive mindset have nowhere else to go in the U.S. I mean, what are we? Who else are we going to vote for? So why should they actually care about us? And that's the fault of progressives or self-proclaimed socialists or the DSA, which has really functioned as a kind of outside, sort of an outside lobby for changing the Democratic Party. It's really it's functioned as a vehicle for changing the character of the Democratic Party, and it doesn't present any alternative to it electorally. So that's the fault of people. I mean, and the way the American political system is set up, it makes it next to impossible to have a real third party challenge. And where I think this country is at right now presents the opportunity for an independent challenger to the uniparty, the permanent war duopoly, the corporate oligarchic duopoly that controls both parties. There is space for that person, but that person wouldn't satisfy what we know of as the U.S. left, because the U.S. left is just it's in its own state of hysteria. It loves canceling people for not checking all of the boxes. It's not strategic, and it doesn't. It's hated. Like its leadership, which basically is a bunch of media influencers and pundits and NGO types and academics, are hated by most normal people in this country who are so fed up and infuriated with the establishment and with the war state, and have no appetite for foreign wars. But they hate that stuff on the left, and so many of them are going to the right, or they're just kind of checking out.
No, I've seen that as well. I'm glad you brought that up. Last week we were talking about this on this show. I was talking about the fact that, or actually a couple months ago, I was talking about the fact that I don't think there's any energy left on the left in reference to the progressive movement per se. I mean, Bernie Sanders did leave his own movement, but I predicted a couple months ago that the next time we see that energy in this country, it's going to come from the right, because they're together, regardless if people like conservatives or not. They're together and they come together in numbers, especially when it's time to protest. And recently, Kim Iverson echoed that same sentiment on Rising. She said, I think that energy is going to come from the right. And I want to get your opinion about that, because I know you were more familiar with the trucker protests. And someone had pointed that out to me in the chat. They said, FYI, the trucker protests. What were some of the things that you saw, like in reference to the trucker protests? Was it just like a right wing like movement, like some people are saying? Was it a mixture of people? And do you think that the next time we have that energy in this country, it's going to come from a different space?
Yeah, I agree with everything you just said. And the same thing in Europe, and the same thing in Canada. Like the right-wing Popular Party is challenging the establishment in a much more substantial way than the NDP, which basically is the establishment, functions kind of like the left wing of the World Economic Forum. I mean, they're just, as much as I can't stand so much of what like the Popular Party stands for, they were threatening the Canadian center much more. You see the same thing across Europe. Who is leading the charge against NATO? With the exception of Jean-Luc Mélenchon in France, it's the right-wing parties. Who destroyed Jeremy Corbyn? He was destroyed from within. It wasn't necessarily a right-wing campaign. Yeah, the Israel lobby waged a very destructive campaign. It was basically like a foreign influence campaign to destroy Jeremy Corbyn, paint him as an anti-Semite. Yes, the national security state in the UK made an effort to paint Jeremy Corbyn as a Russian plant. But fundamentally, it was an attack from within the Labour Party, including from people on the left like Owen Jones or Paul Mason. who would, switch between supporting Corbyn and then amplifying the most hideous attacks on him, or Momentum, the supposed grassroots movement that's sort of like the DSA of the UK. They would do like these anti-Semitism trainings for Labour members and then legitimize all of the attacks against Corbyn instead of pushing back. So he's done. Corbynism is basically a spent force in the UK, although I still really respect what he's doing right now. It just leaves an open field for the right to come in and push back against Brexit, which Corbyn couldn't push back against. And the US is reflecting, we see the same tendencies reflected in the US. With the truckers, like I went and hung out with them and interviewed them, and I still need to get this video up when they were in the DC area in Hagerstown. Mm-hmm. And, there would be these soapbox speeches late at night where everyone would gather there. And some of the rhetoric that I saw being used by their self-appointed leadership, which really turned out to be, I think, a failed leadership, which is a separate story. They were saying, we openly welcome, this is the language they use, we openly welcome the far right and the far left. And if it's not for us, the far right and the far left will have no free speech rights. And they, just like the Canadian truckers, were actually invoking kind of liberal values. The one thing that the truckers in the US wanted to do was end emergency law and restore the Constitution, because the pandemic has been a theater for imposing emergency law and extending it indefinitely. That should be something I would think progressives would support. Same within Canada. What did they want? To restore the Charter of Values, to restore individual and basic rights. The Charter of Values written by Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau, 1992. So they were fighting for what I would consider liberal or even progressive values. But what the organized left saw was a bunch of, big white guys with beards who driving big rigs, who are waving like fuck Trudeau flags, or, and some people have let's go Brandon flags, and they just saw the aesthetic of the right and decided that their job is to fight the right instead of to fight the real class enemy, which is the people who are imposing emergency law in Canada in order to seize people's bank accounts, who have locked down working class Americans, destroyed livelihoods, destroyed small businesses, driven people into destitution, caused record opioid deaths, abused the poorest and most vulnerable children by keeping them out of school and deprived them of their right to education and in many cases a free lunch. I mean, that is what that's what they should have been railing against, but instead they became what I saw as the lockdown left, sort of like the street wing of the Great Reset. And where are they now on the NATO proxy war in Ukraine? There aren't really that many anti-war protests going on. There isn't a lot of activity. So it really does feel like the kind of post-Bernie US left is just a spent force coasting on the glory of past struggles and nostalgia. And I don't know what it really has to offer at this point. And it's a real tragedy, having kind of come from those ranks.
Agreed. I think there's a question for you, Max. I'll go ahead and pull that up. Eric, what do you guys, Max and Sabby, think, since you are organizing a lot of people like me, a longtime tenant organizer in Boston? How are politicians / commentators / journalists like you? What do you think we should do with most Democrat political options off the table? What do you think we should do, given the best people have abandoned TYT and the squad and Groundswell? Max and Sabs. I'll let you go first, Max.
Why don't you actually go first? Because the what should we do questions are always tough for me. I'm just like a critic who snipes from the sidelines,
So one of the things we've been telling people over to RBN, I think a lot of times like we focused on, if we look at the 80-20 rule, we've been putting 80% of our attention and focus into electoral politics and 20% maybe into mutual aid, direct action, if even that. We think we need to flip that, and we need to put 80% into direct action and mutual aid and 20% into electoral politics. And when I talk about electoral politics, I'm mainly speaking about the local level politics, things that you can do in your community, your neighborhood, your town, your city, your state, right? Because that's where you can actually implement change. So I've seen city councilors implement change that way, as well as ballot initiatives as well. Or if you do want to do electoral politics on the federal level still, I encourage people to vote independent or third party, because until you get the money out of the two-party system, they're not really going to do anything for the people. So at the end of the day, it all goes back to the money. Now, some people coming back and they'll say, well, what do you mean by direct action, mutual aid? Direct action, like the trucker protest that we were just talking about, the George Floyd protest. Like, we need to get people out in the streets and mobilize people in this country. And in reference to mutual aid, there's many organizations that you can donate to, but mutual aid is not just money. Sometimes it may mean like carpooling, giving someone a ride that doesn't have a car, babysitting someone's kids for free. I live in Massachusetts. It snows here. Shoveling snow for people who physically cannot shovel snow. So that's like a real thing, like helping people in your community. We gave $100 million to Bernie Sanders. We could have taken that money and put it in mutual aid. We could have actually helped people with that money immediately instead of giving it to a politician and hoping that they get in and do the right thing.
I mean, I agree with much of what you said. I'm very suspicious about mass protests in this country now, given the ability of powerful forces to co-opt them, particularly the security state, which I think was manipulating what became of the George Floyd protest to make it an anti-Trump protest, and was manipulating the right wing as well. I think Kenosha was the perfect theater to witness that manipulation. They wanted to create, it was through a strategy of tension. They wanted to create chaos in the streets to present themselves as the saviors from Trumpism, but also from the extreme left or Antifa. So like their narrative will be seen on Fox and MSNBC at the same time now, that BLM and Antifa and the Proud Boys are the real threat to stability in this country. And they put both of those groups on overdrive. So that's something people need to really be aware of. I think political education is really important, and it's in very short supply. And what we do, we use journalism as a form of political education. And we don't, whenever there's a candidate who presents themselves as anti-war progressive, I often immediately find faults with them, that they don't seem to be very informed on issues of imperialism. They're very malleable, and they parrot a lot of rhetoric that gets thrown around from AOC types. I'm constantly disappointed with the kind of candidates that crop up. So I think it's important that
Agreed.
we work on grooming our own people the same way that the right wing is successfully done. And national politics does seem like a dead end at this point, but it doesn't mean that we should be anti-politics, certainly not apolitical. So local politics can be a ground for cultivating stronger national candidates at some point. And the national platform can be used in congressional races, even by an independent candidate, if they can get in the debates to put forward issues like opposition to imperialism.
Well said. There's one more question for you. Does Max think force the vote exposed the class divide on the left? What does he think about how the U.S. left's response to the Dems cheating Bernie? Thank you so much, Buckeye fan.
In a sense, I think it exposed the class divide. It doesn't mean that everyone who supported force the vote was from the salt of the earth, that they were like laborers who were working in a Chicago slaughterhouse.
Right.
But it just showed that they were fed up with the Democratic Party, that they were sick of being told we're moving too fast, that we're not there yet. And more than that, this was sort of the force the vote conflict was a war of YouTube influencers. And the divide there was between, I think, regardless of what class people come from among those influencers, those who were for force the vote didn't have the middle class mentality that I think most people that identify with the US left have, where they seek respectability and credibility, because respectability and credibility come from elite approval, the approval of people with credentials. And those like Jimmy Dore, for example, could care less about that. He's catering strictly to his audience, which is constantly growing and which is more and more difficult to define along a partisan divide. So I think Force the Vote was an important breaking point, and it really it showed what TYT was, and now it's fully exposed at this point. But there have been so many issues since then. I think the debate around COVID was far more important at exposing the class divide. Or
Well said.
the class sensibility.
Well said. All right, Max, I know you got to go. Where can people find you before you head out?
Well, everybody knows where to find me, but I just started a Telegram channel that I'll be updating more frequently at Real Max Blumenthal. And yeah, I do have a live stream, usually weekly, at Rockfin, and it's mostly exclusive content, but I make it public a few days later. So check me out at Rockfin as well. And thanks as always for having me on.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Max.
All right, Sabby. Good seeing you.
You too.